Hello and welcome back to my channel. If you didn't know, I'm a determinist. I've made, some videos talking about why I don't really believe in free will or basically any form of freedom, essentially, because that's basically what determinism is. Everything is determined. Everything follows already determined structure for how it will be, regardless of how anybody actually feels about it. And there's a kind of determinism that isn't really spoken about as much, so I thought I would make this video bringing more attention to it because I've always described myself as, a bit of a hardcore determinist, let's just say. Compatibilism doesn't make sense to me at all. I know a lot of people will believe that you can have free will and determinism together, which is basically compatibilism in a nutshell. Yeah, free will and determinism are basically compatible, hence you get compatibilism. But for a later video, I'll discuss why that doesn't really make sense to me, but for this video, I wanted to talk more so about linguistic determinism, basically. And in contrast, I guess I also have to mention linguistic relativity, because from the research that I've done, I've noticed that a lot of people have an easier time accepting linguistic relativity, which I think doesn't really make any sense, because for a lot of this video, I can already, see myself talking about how the description for a lot of quote unquote like linguistic relativity is what I think we ought to just bite the bullet and say linguistic determinism, makes more sense basically. So I'll define those quickly and I'll explain why I think linguistic determinism, ultimately makes sense. And even if you want to lean towards linguistic relativity, I don't understand why you can't just bite the bullet and say that linguistic determinism makes more sense. So, because I more so want to talk about linguistic determinism and how I think that makes more sense in the support of linguistic determinism being linguistic relativity, I guess I should simply explain what linguistic determinism basically is. Well, essentially, linguistic determinism talks about how the language that we know limits our understanding of the world, which I think makes sense because basically the language that, we speak obviously shapes our expression in terms of how we categorize the world. And a lot of mental properties, or let's just say, I'm saying a lot of mental properties in the sense that I don't think abstract objects actually exist. So I might draw a lot in on that, I think. But if you want like more further, like in-depth video about that specifically, I made a video about nominalism in which I don't really believe that universals exist and kind of like what I already said, yeah, abstract objects do not basically exist, and that's basically where you get nominalism. And I think this fits neatly into linguistic determinism because if we understand that a lot of things are basically just, in label, then we are not as free as we think. Our own understanding is basically, well, stupid, and I'm not far from accepting basically like high forms of skepticism. You can say Pyrrhonian skepticism, you can say epistemological nihilism. Knowledge may not technically exist, and if knowledge doesn't actually exist, then it's our very own fault of the language that we know. And I think that's where we would basically get linguistic determinism. So basically, a lot of linguistic relativity talks about how basically our understanding of the world through knowledge can influence how we perceive and cultivate our perspectives essentially. And there's a lot of data that I think pretty much backs this up. If you don't believe that your language influences basically how you perceive and what your personality will be like, I suggest looking at a lot of research that basically talks about how a lot of people that are bilingual or speak more than one language basically do have personality shifts depending on what language that they speak. Or when you notice how like grammatical structures can influence like a lot of things, then yeah, I think that obviously makes sense. I mean, you've obviously heard things like, oh, this word in another language doesn't necessarily have like a direct English, translation to it. So maybe you just wouldn't understand it on the same level that basically a native speaker would. But basically, a lot of the linguistic relativity people will basically argue that, like, essentially, some things are harder to translate in another language, perhaps, but it doesn't mean that it's impossible. I guess like they basically fall into the concept of the whole like, oh, explain it to me like I'm five, or where people say, okay, like dumb it down so that I'm able to like understand it. That's basically an example of like linguistic relativity because, for example, if somebody were speaking in very complicated, let's say like highly sophisticated intelligent language, or in layman's terms, a lot of people might just say, oh, they're using a lot of big words. They wouldn't be able to understand it. But a lot of people that believe in linguistic relativity, but not linguistic determinism, will basically say you just have to say it in another way for them to understand. But that, I think, is actually ironically still what proves linguistic determinism to me. Because even if you say they're capable of understanding it, why do they have to be able to understand it in a particular way rather than the way it's already, quote unquote, accessible in like another form that's basically just the same? Which is why, I said, oh, explain this to me like I'm five, or stop using too many big words, basically. Because basically, our language shapes a lot of like the concepts that like we understand. That's why people with higher vocabularies have a harder time talking to people, because again they have to search and search for synonyms. Basically, I think basically if you have a high vocabulary, you engage in linguistic relativity all the time, because basically in order to explain something to somebody that they don't understand in more complicated language that you do, you basically have to find more, I guess, normal or quote unquote, like, oh, say it in layman's terms, or basically like, more simple synonyms for that thing. But basically, if a limitation in vocabulary already for a language that I believe is, quote unquote, like structured, then basically that's how we know that language is pretty much like determined. It cannot go beyond the scope of what it is able to explain and grasp. That's why essentially when you look at a dictionary, you're following the rules and structures in which that word is defined, particularly in the dictionary. So basically, a lot of this is all borrowed, and a lot of this is basically, all jumbled. So technically, language gets us nowhere, or at least like this is separate, quote unquote, from necessarily talking about like linguistic determinism. But I think that language is determined to basically be super unintelligible realistically if you think about it, because what separates us, for example, from like other creatures on earth is that we have highly more intuition than other animals, or we can retain concepts better than um, other animals. And that's why we have like verbal language that can talk about basically like abstract concepts and whatnot. So this actually tells me that a lot of this is so skewed, because have you ever noticed that when somebody's autistic, they don't speak the same way that like a regular person does? And a lot of people often complain about autistic people because like, oh, they're so blunt. But a lot of people on a daily basis basically do talk from a more like intuitive form. So this kind of gives the implication that like basically, I didn't look too much into it, but I think there's something called like mentalese, basically, or it's like expression in your mind, I guess, from like what I don't remember a lot about it, like mentally or something like that. But basically, I think the reason why a lot of people, talk more intuitively for the likings of somebody that's more like neurodivergent, or let's say specifically somebody that's like autistic, is because the need that a lot of things are already implied before they can explicitly be stated. I think that's how language is basically so like limited, and it's already determined for like a particular way. I think the only reason that people are uncomfortable with the idea of like linguistic determinism, or you could even say just determinism in general, is because people do not want to feel trapped. Or regardless of however they feel, you're already trapped in that feeling, whether you feel good or whether you feel bad. So basically, it's kind of stupid. And I think, like, you should just bite the bullet and just accept that basically everything is essentially determined. So basically, if you know a lot of words, even within like, or like basically within like the realm at which the language is accessible and can be, expressed, why do people get, like so uncomfortable about that when it's basically like the same form? Like a lot of people don't like it when you speak so bluntly, which they might say a lot of autistic people do, or very like, straight to the point, because people will say something and will not necessarily like literally mean it to mean that they mean it. Because for example, I think like an example for like basically like a neurotypical and neurodivergent miscommunication that like I've noticed, people have even suspected that like I'm autistic. I made a video specifically talking about like why INTPs are mistaken to be autistic, which they can or can't be. I don't want to make such a bold statement and say that like, oh, INTPs by default are like autistic or whatever. That's another video that like I made. So like again, you can watch that if you want like further clarification about that specifically. But basically, let's say for example, a neurotypical person can say to one autistic person, you know, are you gonna eat lunch? But technically, they're not actually literally asking the question, are you gonna eat lunch? The subtle communication is more, do you want to go to lunch with me? And maybe the autistic person can get confused because they like to take things more literally or as how it's actually defined. Because what I've noticed is that a lot of autistic people do like structure. So being asked that question, oh, are you gonna eat lunch? They might just say yes and then basically look awkward because they're just standing there for no reason when again the subtle communication was more of like an invite to say, hey, do you want to eat lunch with me? But if you said, do you want to eat lunch with me, obviously they would have like understood it better. So if in a lot of ways people talk in this more like intuitive fashion rather than using the words that are already at their disposal, it shows how limited I already believe that like humans are at like using language, and it's like super dumb. That's why nobody likes the guy that's always basically picking at semantics, which I'm often the guy that picks at semantics. If I'm being honest, I'm a pretty philosophical guy. I'm an INTP, so if you know a thing or two about like that kind of typology, I lead with introverted thinking, which is basically the need for like logical structure and like categorization. I need to know that everything that either what I say or another person says follows from like A to B to C to, whatever, all that kind of stuff. I actually try my best to eliminate intuition as much as possible, despite the fact that I am a very intuitive person, which is why naturally when I talk about all the things, I can delve into like a lot of like concepts and stuff. And if it's not obvious, I do have ADHD. I have another video talking about like my ADHD. So if you want to check that out, it's also like, further down in my channel, if basically like, you're interested. So I think when I consider linguistic determinism, it actually makes me feel better about the notion that I am the guy that is annoyingly picking at like semantics, quote unquote, because like if we know that we're already so limited in like the language that like we speak, why would we not make it easier by speaking of like definitions of like the things that like we're actually saying? So like, do you mean this? Do you mean that? Because the subtle communication in which most people speak is actually like like super annoying, and that's what linguistic determinism has made me realize, because it's already so like flawed, and that's the reason why we have to go through like specific let's say like an intuitive leap to just assume that everybody else is going to know that like what we're talking about. And it works for the most part, I guess, because obviously most people are like neurotypical and whatnot. So I think like probably most people don't have like an issue with subtle communication, but I could think especially concepts such as like linguistic determinism would be hard for a lot of people to believe, is because they axiomatically believe that the definitions they hold are already basically fitting of like what they actually intend to mean, when it can be taken in like a whole bunch of like different directions, despite the fact that again language is very limited. Because what I learned when I consider like linguistic determinism is that things are not actually about definition, they're more so about like connotation basically. So like I don't know if this is a good example or not, but like basically like if you call somebody stupid, that might be taken, like in the wrong way. It could be considered offensive. It could be considered rude. But if you, I guess, were to say it in like a nicer way and be like, oh, you might want to think this through a bit more. It's basically saying the same thing when you think about it, because basically, if you call somebody stupid, you're, basically telling them that like they lack the knowledge that they need in order to be right. But if you also say it in a nicer way, which is basically maybe something like, kind of like what I said, oh, you might want to like reconsider that like a little bit. There's no like harsh intent to it. So what I've noticed is that basically all words are essentially just synonyms, but they define more so connotations rather than like the definitions themselves. So this is why basically language is a very like flawed concept, or like the notion of being free in any sort of capacity, even starting at like our language and the form of like expression that is most prevalent in human beings, like our verbal language, is obviously very skewed, because our mental properties are very much skewed. And again, I'm just going to point that back to like a high sense of like skepticism, our need to like understand but not actually like understand anything. Like it's the paradox. And again, we can think again about like, oh, the problem of like criterion, because when I think of language, it basically is a game of epistemology when you like think about it, because what are words attempting to do? They're attempting to define concepts. And if you think about it philosophically, what is that trying to do? Also define concepts. And when you think about it psychologically, that's also trying to define, I guess, like, temperaments, whatever, and all this kind of stuff. And when you understand that people are on like different spectrums about this, despite the fact that like we're all actually limited, this is what creates this like whole like, extreme mess basically. So a lot of people will cling on to linguistic relativity as like a false hope to think that like, okay, we can get like better understanding, our language is not actually limited. But like, yes, it is. That's why we can talk about idealistic ideas. That's why we can be dreamers, or like, just like take the philosophy of like idealism basically, but it will never actually be true. Because to think, if I were to define language in like one simple word, basically, I think like it is basically idealistic. It is basically idealism because, you know, like what I've said before, humans are the only people that are capable of having like, well, yeah, humans are people basically, but having an existential crisis apart from like the other animals that simply do not care and just actually stay in zen because they don't like torment themselves with concept or a need for purpose, blah blah blah. They just follow their like natural biological drive, and we also follow our natural biological drive obviously, but we have language, so we have like limited ways in trying to define things that give us the illusion, because kind of like what I always said, free will always be like an illusion. So it's like regardless of how many words that I pick up or how many words that like I try to like understand, they're still limited by the structure in which it is obviously defined. So it can never be free. If you see a big word or a word that like you don't understand and you look it up in the dictionary, and you see that definition and it's borrowed by somebody else, and blah blah blah, all this kind of stuff. So like basically, that my definition of language is not even expression. It's basically just like made up sort of like idealism. So like honestly, language, like everything, basically tells me that like things are a lie. This is all a determined mess that doesn't actually make sense, even straight to like the point of language. And I guess like I'll simply say this. People think of linguistic relativity as something that basically, like looks like basically because like irrelativity is in the definition of it, which basically means that like okay, we can incorporate like a whole bunch of like things, incorporate like a whole bunch of things. Shit, I forgot the thought that I was going with that. But oh, okay, okay. This is what I thought. Like again, it's synonyms that are basically trying to find the right connotation when a person basically says it. So if there are concepts that we do not have the word for, we will never be able to explain it. Even if it's like an intuitive thing, you will never be able to like express it to like anybody. So sure, if it's very personal that you can understand just how expressive you actually are, it still might as well be useless to basically everyone else, around you, because we will never have that access in which from a mentalese perspective, be able to like get that. But the ironic thing about that though is if you treat language to be something so personal, you can't still negate that basically language is supposed to be an expression for a social species to interact with basically other members of the tribe. And like again, I'll keep saying it, it's basically already super limited. And again, if there are concepts that exist beyond the scope of what our language is not capable of doing, we will never have access to those concepts basically. So I can talk about things that I don't know that we can potentially know, but that's as far as it'll get. And basically, when you think about it, it doesn't actually matter. So within our language, you're no different than a robot that's programmed to basically say, I don't know, like a few words or like a few, like whatever, or like an AI or something. So I don't understand why humans think they're so special. I don't understand why people think like their consciousness is so special because, at like a baseline, your language should already scream that like, you're fucked. You exist in a concept and you're not actually saying anything, and you might as well just exist basically in some sort of like black void. So yeah, I'm not sure if I should be saying anything else, but I think I've said a good amount of stuff for, people to like contemplate and like, delve into like this idea. So linguistic relativity, despite having like relativity, are all the good, I think like support for linguistic determinism, despite the wedge that I've seen within like any bit of research that I've like done on this. I don't disagree with linguistic relativity, but I do not think that linguistic relativity can eliminate linguistic determinism, basically.